The economy of Detroit is one of the main pillars on which the American economy rests and is heading for collapse. Once the shining light of American industry, much of the Motor City has fallen into ruin. Detroit has a population of over 5 million people and almost 250,000 businesses. The unemployment rate in urban areas has reached almost 16% in April of 2012. In July, Detroit became the largest city in American history to declare bankruptcy. And after more than 50 years of decline, the economic failure of the Motor City could spread to other cities. As the economy of Detroit crumbled, the bottom fell out of the housing market. Some properties began to sell for as little as $1. Detroit now has over 78,000 abandoned buildings. With these low prices, Chinese businesses are buying up real estate in the city at a staggering rate. Single Chinese businesses and individuals are buying dozens of property at a time. Some Chinese interests have inquired about buying hundreds of Detroit properties in single purchases. Our guest today is Karen DeCoster. She's a writer who studies economics and the role of government in society. DeCoster is a regular guest writer for LouRockwell.com, and she describes herself as the queen of political incorrectness. She's our guest and here to talk to us about the Detroit bankruptcy and what it could mean for the rest of America. Karen, welcome back to WHDT World News.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Karen, what happened to drive Detroit into bankruptcy?
Well, there's multiple events that have occurred over the last many years, going back 50, 60 years when we started to see the population loss and obviously the 67 riots. But really some of the big drivers of the bankruptcy event have been, you keep hearing the numbers recited in the media, and those numbers are that there's been $8 billion in liabilities and another $10 billion in unfunded pension liabilities. So the stories usually report between $18 and $20 billion in debt that we can no longer pay back. You also have years and years of uncontrolled expenses, and this can be seen on the part of all mayoral regimes, at least since the 1970s. You've also had billions of dollars in borrowings taking place, and the amazing thing about these borrowings is not just to fund pet projects, but also those borrowings were to cover the day-to-day operations of the government. And we've also had political incentives here over the years to fund political pet projects, one being the Chrysler Jefferson Avenue plant many years ago. And in 2005, we had kind of a seminal event, and that's when Wall Street convinced our mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick, also known as the hip-hop mayor, that he needed to restructure the pension fund debt for the city of Detroit. So this was in 2005. And some of the analysts have looked at this and said over the years, this restructuring, which Wall Street made a lot of money on, by the way, will cost the city of Detroit approximately $3 billion over the next 15 or 20 years. But we've also been a one-horse town. We focused on one industry, the auto industry. There's been the big three and the multiple tier suppliers. We've also had a racial divide here that caused white flight going back to the 70s and the 80s and loss of a tax base. And the city kept spending the money. However, the revenues were steadily declining. Another thing is while we had this decline in revenue going on, uptick in expenditures, the city was desperately trying to come up with new taxes as a way of covering that shortfall and covering their deficits. And I guess lastly, you hear a lot about Detroit about the retiree problem we have here. There's a lot of largesse on the part of the city of Detroit in retirement benefits. Over the last about 12 or 13 years alone, we have seen in our healthcare cost alone for retirees for the city of Detroit have gone up 50% in less than 13 years. So that's a culmination of multiple events.
Now, what would happen if Detroit did not declare bankruptcy?
Well, essentially, Detroit wouldn't be able to pay its bills. And the reason is because Standard & Poor's had downgraded Detroit multiple times. And I think our most recent rating is CC, which is about 10 grades below investment rating. So meanwhile, we have all these day-to-day expenses, payroll, and short-term creditors as well as long-term creditors where those payments have to be met. And the city is no longer able to meet those payments because they can no longer borrow to pay down those day-to-day expenses.
Now, what about other cities? What can they learn from the mistakes that were made in Detroit that brought it to where it is now?
Well, you hear a lot about other cities. Cities named are Chicago, Camden, New Jersey, Cincinnati, Washington, D.C. And as one media story reported quite hilariously, every single major city in California is in danger of being bankrupt. We already saw Stockton, California, and Jefferson County, Alabama go bankrupt. But these cities, I think they have a little bit of I wouldn't say they have an advantage to us, but I think they have different alternatives available to them to avoid bankruptcy. Again, most of these cities don't rely on one industry for a number of decades. And, it's an industry where the union has been deeply embedded. And therefore, there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of largesse in terms of our pensioners. But also, I don't really expect that there will be this huge leap forward in terms of large municipalities claiming bankruptcy, because remember, it is very difficult to get the approval and be determined eligible to declare bankruptcy under Chapter 9. Detroit, we're still in those stages where our eligibility is being looked at very carefully.
Now, how has the city changed since it declared bankruptcy?
Well, the city's changed a lot. Now, financially, not a lot of change. It's very early in the process. Again, we're still looking at eligibility in the court system. But politically, that's where you're seeing a lot of the changes. And I would define that politically as being us versus them mentality here. So you have the pensioners, and they've been used to this, this bounty over the years. They've been promised their pensions. They've been promised their health care. So they've developed a very divisive environment here. It's the unions and the pensioners versus everybody else. And when our emergency manager, Kevin Orr, took over, there have been multiple media quotes as well as snippets on the news, so I'm really not making this up, where African Americans are referring to the fact that we have an emergency manager trying to manage this financial situation. They have referred to it as a return to slavery. So as long as this mentality exists, they're creating a very divisive us versus them mentality, when in reality, this system we have here in the city of Detroit, it's a system of the working people, and largely a lot of younger people, funding our retirees. This is unsustainable. And you look at the pension benefits these retirees have from the city of Detroit, they're remarkable. People are retiring after 30 years at 50 years old. The average person, depending on whether you're male or female, you have 25 to 35 years of lifespan left. You have multiple years of productivity left, and you're retiring, you're on the dole for the rest of your life. It is completely unsustainable.
Now, I want to talk about the stories of China buying up sections of Detroit. I also want to talk about what can be done to return Detroit to being a financially stable city, but we are up against a break. Stay tuned for more. We're talking with Karen DeCoster right here on WHDT World News.